Hello everyone, I am Tivia Mckenzie and welcome to another episode of a line-by-line analysis of one of the 20 CSEC English B poems which I conduct on a weekly basis. This week, I'll analyze the poem My Parents by Stephen Spender, where the person recalls a childhood memory where his or her parents kept him or her from the rough neighborhood street children. So unlike many of the other poems on the prescribed CSEC English B poetry list, this week's poem is short, descriptive, and explores themes such as bullying, poverty, social class, and social acceptance. So come along with me as I employ an analysis of the poem's structure, stanzas, themes, tones, moods, and poetic devices. So without further ado, let's begin by reading the poem. My Parents by Stephen Spender. My parents kept me from children who were rough, who threw words like stones and wore torn clothes. Their ties showed through rags. They ran in the street and climbed cliffs and stripped by the country streams. I fed more than tigers, their muscles like iron, their jerking hands and their knees tight on my arms. I fed the salt coarse pointing of those boys who copied my lips behind me on the road. They were lithe. They sprang out behind hedges like dogs to bark at my world. They threw mud while I looked the other way, pretending to smile. I longed to forgive them, but they never smiled. Before we analyze the poem line by line and stanza by stanza, it is important to comment on the structure of the poem. So this particular poem has 3 stanzas. It is also a quatrain, which is a series of 4 lines that make up one verse of a poem, which is also known as a stanza. It is also the form of enjambment, right? This refers to a thought or clause that does not come to an end at the line break and it continues in the next line. So you will see that as we move from stanza to stanza in the upcoming poem. It also has no specific rhyme scheme. Okay, let's begin with stanza 1. But before we begin with stanza 1, every time I discuss this poem with students, okay, I often ask students to volunteer, sharing with me a moment in their life where, especially when they were younger, when their parents deprived them or their parents told them that they couldn't do something or they couldn't say something or they couldn't go somewhere, right? And of course, the hands will go up. Students usually have a lot to say about what their parents didn't allow them to do. Okay, and of course, the story or whatever memory they're sharing always boils down to them saying that I think that my parents, they need to be a bit more lenient with me. They need a bit more freedom, okay? And sometimes I will ask them in the end, do you think that your parents were trying to protect you? Or is it the case that they wanted to just, take away your freedom, to just control you and tell you what to do, what to say, and so on? And of course, they will always lean towards parents just deliberately wanted to restrict their freedom. But they will admit, after going back and forth with different questions, that really and truly, I think my parents really loved me, but, I would just appreciate a bit more freedom. So today's poem come to us on a day we call Mother's Day, which is celebrated in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and I believe other parts of the world as well, where persons express love and appreciation to their mothers for the different sacrifices they would have made for them during their lifetime. Okay? So as we go through this poem, I'm hoping at least that you two will be nostalgic at some points in the poem when you were a child, okay? About the different things that you were allowed to do or not allowed to do, right? So let's begin with stanza 1. So stanza 1 says that my parents kept me from children who were rough. So as it relates to the title of the poem is called My Parents, which suggests that the poem will be about the person's parents. But this is not the case generally, because we'll realize as we analyze the poem stanza by stanza that this, besides the title and stanza 1, these are the only times we will hear the person really directly referring to his or her parents, okay? However, the person says, my parents kept me from children who were rough. The word kept there actually suggests that the person was actually asked to do something that he or she didn't want to do. Okay, that he or she felt deprived from the different things or the control that the person's parents had over their life. Okay, so my parents kept me from children who were rough. Rough suggests that these children were seen by the person's parent as unmannerly or uncultured or They didn't know how to behave. They were rough in their activities, in their behavior, or even the type of words that they used. So having observed this, the parents didn't want their son or their daughter to be associated with these street children, these rough children. Okay? Now, line 2 says that these children, they were described as who threw words like stones, right? We know that if you throw a stone to hit somebody, that the stone will hit whatever is in its path, and of course, it will result most likely in pain, okay? So the words that the children use, that they were very painful, and these are some of the observations, and believe it or not, most parents, especially those who are very protective of their children, if they observe other people's children behaving in a particular way that are unbecoming for them, they will do everything in their power to keep their child or their children from playing with them or associating with them, okay? So the person's parents looked on and realized that these children, they were rough and they threw words like stones, right? And this is an example of a simile, and they wore torn clothes or clothing. So for the persona, notice that this is a decision that the persona's parents have made from observation, and the person is looking on and he's giving us the reasons why he or she believed that his or her parents didn't want him or her to play with these children. And I'm not giving the persona a gender because a gender was not identified in the poem. Most persons, when they are studying Stephen's poem, because he was an activist for class struggle and identity and
different socioeconomic issues, persons tend to say that this is the poet's life. The poet actually took uses a poem to talk about issues that occurred in his lifetime. I know you can study a poem by looking at the persona or the poet's life, okay? But rightfully, I think that when you're studying a poem, you must be able to separate the poet's life sometimes from the poem itself, although the poet's life sometimes shed light on the poem and help our understanding of the poem from time to time, okay? So where this poem is concerned, a gender was not identified. So I will say from time to time, his or her, right? Okay, so we get some example of visual imagery, right? Besides the simile, who threw words like stone, we learn that there are visual imagery where the clothing that these children wear, that they are torn, right? Which suggests that these children are poor, okay, considering the way in which they are dressed. Line 3 says, their ties showed through rags, so their clothes were so damaged and torn that you can see their skin under their clothing, which is an example of visual imagery, because when we examine different visual imagery in stanza 1, we will see that really and truly they're there to highlight the children's poverty, freedom, and the activities the persona was not allowed to do. Okay? So their ties are showed through rags, and rags of clothes, of course, we know, are clothes that are damaged, they are dirty, they're discolored, they are torn there. But, the children are wearing them still. And notice that they ran in the street. They seem to have no restriction. They just ran, freely and go about their daily activities. And the person also observed that they climbed cliffs and stripped by the country streams. Okay, notice the use of the alliteration there, which is the repetition of the consonant song, the C in climbed and the C in cliffed as well. And the alliteration actually alliterated or highlighted that the children are poorer than the persona. And it also shows that the social distance between the children and the persona, as well as their risky activities, which we are seeing in the word in the alliterated, the S in stripped and the S in streams. Okay, so they're actually stripped by the country streams. And usually, that is expected of children, all right? I remember being from the Caribbean that we lived next to a river, and whenever there was what we will say like river come down, where the after a storm or something, they will have like a deep pond, and we would just take off our clothes as children and enjoy the water. Children generally do not pay attention to things like nakedness, really, right? So I could understand the children in this poem's mindset, right? But the person, however, saw this as something strange, because obviously it suggests that these are not some of the activities or some of the things that occurred in the person's household. Nevertheless, we can use these poetic devices on our right to enhance our understanding of what is happening in stanza 1. And of course, there's some diction there. We can use words like kept, rough, torn, stones,
rags, strips, and they, right? In order to, basically understand what was really happening there while the person was telling us about the children who he or she was not allowed to play with. So in stanza 2, the person says, I fared more than tigers, their muscles like iron. Okay, so the person begins stanza 2 using what we call a hyperbole, which is a literary device and a poetic device. So the person exaggerates his or her fear here in order to convey how fearful he or she was of the children. Okay, notice that the person says that, you know what, more than tigers, I fear these children. We know it's an exaggeration because when persons usually see tigers, especially if they are loose, one will tend to just scatter because we know when a tiger comes, it comes to eat, to destroy, okay, to devour. The person went on and said that I fear more than tigers, their muscles like iron. Okay, this is an example of a simile where the person compares the children's muscles to that of iron to show how muscular they were, right? And to really to emphasize their strength as well. The person in line 2 says their jerking hands and their knees tight on my arms, right? So when for something to be jerking, it means that it's actually to make a short, sudden movement. So their jerking hands suggest that they will make movement with their hands without notice, right? Whether to hit the persona or even observe the person observing their movements. But the idea is that they were so swift in what they were doing that the person says that they're jerking hands and their knees tight on my arms. Their knees tight on my arms suggest physical abuse, even bullying, right? These are some of the things that they would have done to the persona after, whether it has to do it whenever they got close to the persona, whether they sneaked up on the persona, but when they got close to the persona, that it will all result in some sudden movement, okay? Or their knees will end up on the persona's hands as if they are wrestling, right? But that's an example of physical abuse. We have in line 3, I fear the salt coast pointing of those boys. Line 3 there, that's another example of the fear highlighted by the persona. I fear the salt coast pointing of those boys. Okay, this actually alludes to the saying to rub salt in a wound. You know, when you rub salt in a wound, you actually make a situation worse for someone. So besides the fact that the person already fear them and they are rough, and they actually, with their joking hands, they usually have their knees tight on the persona's arm, right? To make matters worse, these are some of the things that they do to the persona, right? It's bad enough that I am not from your world. It's bad enough that you will meet me from time to time and physically abuse me. It is an example of bullying as well, a form of bullying, right? The person says that to make matters worse. What these boys do in the last line of stanza 2, they even copied my lips behind me on the road, right? My lips there is actually a speech impediment or a speech defect that specifically relates to making the songs associated with letter S and Z. So persons who have this particular impediment, speech impediment, have problems with pronouncing words with pronouncing letters such as S and Z, right? So when the person says that I fear the salt coast pointing of those boys, whenever they saw the persona, they will be pointing at the persona, right? And by pointing the persona, they would have been, making the persona very self-conscious. And besides that, they recognize that the persona had what we call a lips, which is a speech impediment where persons have difficulty pronouncing, words with words that contain letters such as S and Z. Right, they will copy him, or what persons will say from time to time, especially can we say like jeering, where they will speak in the manner in which the persona spoke, right, just to make fun of him. And of course, they will make the persona self-conscious and even ashamed of himself as well. Right, so in stanza 2, there are examples of similes there. And the simile in line 1, it highlights the children's brute strength and the persona's weakness and admiration of the street children. Because even though the person says that their muscles are like irons, their muscles are like iron, basically the person is really drawing attention to their strength and admiring these children, okay? And the person seems to be doing this from a distance as well. There's an example there of hyperbole and also visual imagery, right? We see it there with their joking hands and even the position of their knees tight on the persona's arms. There's an example of an allusion, the repetition, and auditory imagery is seen there in red. right, where we can imagine hearing the children behind the person or close to the person or just repeating what he said in the manner in which it was said as well. And of course, there are examples of diction using one of those words I spoke about. Remember, when we are using diction as a poetic device, you identify the word first, you give a definition of the word and an example of how it is used in the poem and comment on its effectiveness, which means that you should comment on how this particular example or this particular word enhance your interpretation or understanding of the situation in the poem. So we are now at stanza 3. So stanza 3 says they were light. Light there means they were agile, they were athletic, they moved about easily, okay? They were filled with energy. And notice that they sprang out behind hedges, right? Which suggests, and these are all examples of visual imagery, it suggests that these children actually laid hidden, waiting for the persona to jump and to frighten him or her as he or she walks by on their journey. Right? So they sprang out behind hedges, which suggests that they really had fun they really enjoyed themselves making fun of the persona. And notice that the person said that they did this like dogs to back up my wall. Now, it is one thing to hear in stanza 1 or 2, especially in stanza 1, that my parents kept me from children who were rough, right? These children were described as rough. Their clothes they wore rags, and you saw their ties under their rags and so on, right? Which gives us the impression that these are the persona's parents' perspective of the children, right? But here in stanza 3, notice that the person is using the word dog to describe the persona, right? Not to describe the persona, but to describe the children's behavior. Right? It's one thing to say that somebody is a dog, and even to say that, somebody behaved like a dog, because what do we know about behaving like a dog or a dog? You're basically suggesting, in this case, the person is suggesting that the children behaved in an animalistic manner, right? And notice what manner the person described. The person says that they bark at the person's wall. At my wall, they can mean the person's way of life. So it can be that literally when they saw the persona, they started barking like a dog, or it can be that they started mocking the persona world or way of life because they observed that the person is different from them. He or she might have been, wearing a suit or a uniform on his way to school while they're at home, roaming the street in rags and dirty and so on, okay? Although the person observed that these children are different from him or her, the children as well realize that the person is different. It is more than a case that the person has a lips, which is a speech impediment, right? But the children will realize that really and truly this is somebody who's sheltered. He's boring. He or she doesn't know how to have fun. Okay, so the children wanted to bring some sort of excitement in their lives, right? They waited for the person and they sprang out behind hedges, and notice that they behaved like dogs, right? They barked at the person's wall, right? Which shows that, they are mocking the person's way of life or the person's way of doing things. The person also said that they threw mud while I looked the other way. This is really a form of bullying. Notice that when they saw the persona, they will just have mud there waiting just to throw at the person. And mud is something that relates to dirt, right? When you throw mud on somebody, you really intend to smear them and to dirty them as well. And notice how the persona behaved when this is done to him or her. The persona did what? Looked the other way. This is an example of an allusion in the Christian Bible in St. Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 to 39, which says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also." Okay, this is an encouragement in the Christian Bible, and it suggests that the person has Christian upbringing, and also it can also suggest that the person was just timid and really fearful of actually fighting for him or herself, right? When these things were done to him or her by the children, the street children. But notice after this was done to the person, and look at what the person did. He pretended to smile. It's the case that the person decided to smile because he or she is actually listening to teaching such as turn the other cheek when somebody does something to you? Or is it the case that this was the person actually covering up him or her really true feelings, or covering or shielding how hurt these children made the person feel? Okay, sometimes it is said that when something is done to you, right? Especially something that brought pain. If you keep masking it and you keep covering it, it will continue to happen to you, especially in the case that where you're being abused, you usually have to speak up. If you don't say something, that persons will really think that it is okay. However, in this poem, in this stanza, we see that the persona, look at what the persona did, he or she looked the other way, pretending to smile. And notice in the last line, the persona says, I longed to forgive them, but they never smiled. Okay, so amazing fact that the person realized that these children, they're running wild, they're behaving like dog, their clothing is very unbecoming. Notice that the person has had this longing deep inside of him or her to actually forgive them, but they never smiled, right? Notice for the persona, forgiveness didn't come easily, as in, even though y'all did whatever you did to me, I forgive you. The persona seemed to want it to a smile in exchange for their forgiveness as well, okay? There are persons who tend to look at this line and say, for example, that the them here refers to the persona's parents, right? A case where after having shared my experiences, having shared or being aware of what your deprivation or your guidance as parents, the socialization I received from you, because of its effect and so on that occurred as a result, I wanted to forgive you, but you never smiled to me, right? For me, I don't see them as referring to the parents. I think even in this case, in that line, that the person is really referring still to the children. Okay, so the title of the poem is called My Parents, right? But in most of the stanzas, as we go through the poem, the person keeps talking about these children, the street children, and so on, right? So it's not a case that the persona seems to be blaming his parents. If anything, the socialization that was given to the persona, because of the way the persona was socialized, the street children or children who were different from the persona saw him or her as strange, and as a result, the persona was bullied. Okay? So on our right here, as usual, we have our poetic devices here. Notice I forgot to point out in line 2 where the person says that they behave like dogs to bark at my wall. It's an example of auditory imagery and also an example of onomatopoeia. So while auditory imagery, that's when we use words to appeal to the reader's sense of hearing. We know that onomatopoeia are words that suggest their song, right? Like words such as bark, right? So there we go. Let me also point out the contrast in this poem, right? So on one hand, we see the parent's desire to protect the child versus the person's wishful feeling, right? Or feelings for freedom. And it's also ironic because one would assume because the person seems to be of a higher class and seem to be more privileged than the children, that the person would have been happy, but we realize this is not the case. The person really long to play with these children, long to strip at the stream and to climb cliffs and just to roam freely, right? So these are some of the themes in the poem. If you can identify any more, feel free to share them in the comment section below. So there's an example of childhood experience. The entire poem is a memory of the persona when he or she was a child, okay? There's example of people and desire. We realize that the persona had a desire to befriend these children, to do the things that they did, to climb the cliffs, to strip at the streams, just to behave free, doing which they did in the street. However, even the persona's parents, they had a desire to keep their child from rough children who wore rags, children who seem to be unmannerly, okay? There's also examples of discrimination where the street children were discriminated against because they were poor, right? It's obvious that the persona is of a different social class than the children who roamed the street and did whatever they did, who seem to not have any parent breathing down their necks, right? So as a result, because the children are poor, because they were rough, because they wore rags, because they throw words like stone, they were not allowed to be the persona's friend, right? Also, we see examples of socialization and its effects because of their parents, the persona's parents' decision to keep him or her from children who were rough, that this resulted in the persona being bullied by the street kids. Right? There's also, examples of bullying and examples of desire and reality. The persona actually desires to be friends with these rough children, but in reality, they thought he was too stoosh. They thought that he or she taught things or thought that they were better than the children. Okay, there's a conflict there, and there's complication because of what the parents want and what the persona wants. So there's this unbalance there. There's also example of poverty seen through the children clothing, right? And also example of social class. There's the persona is from a higher social class, while the children on the street children, they're poor. They're from a lower class as well. And there are examples of deprivation. Notice the beginning of the poem. The person says that my parents kept me from children who were rough, which suggests that the person really wanted to engage in the activities that these children were engaged in as well. However, his or her parents didn't want this for them. And of course, social acceptance, there was this yawning where the person says in the last line of the poem that I longed to forgive them. Not just forgive them, but the person hoped, there's this wishful tone there, the person hoped that in time they will accept me for who I am, and I will be able to be a part of their crew. I'll be able to, just play with them and do the things that they did as well as they roam through the streets. So these are some of the tones in the poem. When we talk about tones, we're referring to the person's attitude towards the subject. So there's an example of resentment, right, which is bitterness or dissatisfaction on the part of the persona towards his or her parents. The persona says in line 1 that my parents kept me, which suggests that the persona feels that he or she was deprived from having the opportunity to befriend or to participate, to befriend these 3 children and to participate in their activities as well. There's a sense of longing or yearning from the persona, longing to forgive the children, longing to participate in the climbing of the cliffs and even their stripping at the stream, the community rivers. There's this yearning that the persona really or wish that he or she had that opportunity. There's an example of the person feeling disheartened, right? Loss of confidence or determination. Even if this is even seen in the last line where the person says that I long to forgive them, but they never smiled, right? So because this didn't happen, the person actually lost any hope that these 3 children will come around and they will one day be friends. There's also examples of admiration, as the person spoke about their muscles, right? And the way in which the children, they were led where they were agile, they were athletic, they just move around very freely, right? Remember, the person is standing from a distance observing the behavior of these children, right? There's also examples of a fearful tone. The person says, using the example of repetition, that I feared more than tigers, right? There's examples of sadness. When they met the persona, they will copy his speech impediment. They will wait while he's on his way home or wherever he or she is going and actually throw mud at him or her, right? And the person seems envious as well, for the life that they live in, because the person seems to be sheltered, right? Even though the person is sheltered, he or she still looks on, hoping or wishing that he or she could have been involved in some of the activities. And of course, one of the main tone there is that the person has a sense of feeling wishful, which is showing not having feelings or the regretful longing that, this didn't happen at this particular time of the person's life. The person wished more than anything else that he or she had the opportunity to actually be in the community streets, climbing cliffs, and just running freely in the community streets. And of course, when we talk about moods, we are talking about the persona's choice of words and how they made us feel having read them, right? So for me, the examples of sympathy for the persona, especially while the person was being bullied and, in the form of mud being thrown at him or her, and the children's legs and ties on the person's neck, and as the person walked by, they will mock the person's speech. So for me, I felt sympathetic. And of course, the poem made me reflective, because of course the main theme in this poem is childhood experience, and I had childhood where I was always in the neighborhood area playing cricket, not football. And I remember, climbing mountains, like going to the actual mountain where my grandfather walked, and even bathing in the community river as well, right? It really made me look back And of course, there was sadness of the treatment of the persona, even at the end where he said that, really and truly, I really want to be friends with them. I really longed for it, but it did happen, And of course, I felt nostalgic, about my childhood, about the different experiences I had. Not all of them are listed in this poem, but it reminded me of some of my experiences with my cousins. Thank you for listening. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and also check out my other videos, which should be on the screen any minute now.